I am Colby Sumner, and this is America, Fog of War.
Pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic. Men's souls will be shaken with the violences of...
The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it. And one path we shall never choose, and that is the path of surrender.
I can hear you! I can hear you! The rest of the world hears you! And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of it.
We're told that on his body was found a diary. Under the heading, My Pledge, he had written these words: America must win this war. Therefore, I will work, I will save, I will sacrifice, I will endure.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining us again for another Hip Pocket History. I am Colby Sumner, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Brett Thomas. How you doing today, buddy?
Doing very well. Got a haircut last week. It's
I know, dude. You're looking fresh.
a little bit of a motivator, but I'll take it. You know,
Looking fresh.
Yeah.
It looks like Monday morning on Camp Lejeune.
Yep.
You know,
yeah, everybody.
minus the beard.
True.
Minus the beard. Well, so this is our seventh episode in the series, and we are well underway in the Battle of Guadalcanal.
Yes.
And last time we covered the battle at Alligator Creek, and then obviously Edson's Ridge, and now we're moving on to the remainder of the battle, which I felt like I had a pretty good grasp on most of the information on this battle before we got into it, but I didn't realize just how long and big this campaign for Guadalcanal is.
Oh, it's monstrous. This is the original learning curve for everybody.
Right. And there's just numerous battles and different units, and it's you see I don't know, man, there's just so much to go over, and we've talked about a lot already. There's still so much more to cover. So I guess we should just get right into it. So
Yeah, man.
like I said last time, we left off in the aftermath of the battle at Edson's Ridge with the 1st Raider Battalion. We're going to pick up now on September 18th of 1942. The first reinforcements that make it to Guadalcanal Island are going to be the 7th Marines, reinforced with the 11th Marine Regiment as well. And for those of you that want kind of an inside look at how the Marine Corps organizes its units, so regimentally, right? So you get 1st Marine Regiment all the way through the 9th Marine Regiment. That's infantry. And then I believe it starts with the 10th Marines all the way up, I want to say, through the 19th or 20th Marines. Maybe it's the 19th. All the way up to the 19th is artillery. Maybe it's not all the way through the 19th. I know that 10, 11, and 12 are artillery.
We saw the 13th there.
13th is
artillery. And
maybe so it might switch somewhere in there to a different element. We were infantry, so that's the only reason why we know the 1st through the 9th are infantry. But the different different groupings of numbers will mean different things. So the 11th Marines, who are attached to the 7th Marine Regiment, that's an artillery regiment. It's specifically one battalion, 1st Battalion of the 11th Marines. So General Vandergrift, the commander-in-chief here on Guadalcanal, he's in charge of all the land operations in this campaign. He now has 10 infantry batteries, 1 understrength Raider battalion, and 5 artillery battalions on Guadalcanal. The 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines had come over as well from Tulagi, so he's consolidated his forces, and he begins to reorganize the defensive perimeter around Lunga Point. Sometimes we'll refer to that as the Lunga defenses, sometimes the Henderson Field defenses. I guess it depends on the context of the story, but that's the same area. Yeah. He's going to consolidate them and then reorganize this defensive perimeter into 10 sections so that he can control, I guess, the flow of men and supplies and pace of battle better when you have it, broken into sections like that. Sectors. My apology. Earlier in this battle, he had given like the engineer battalion, the pioneer battalion, which is the pioneer battalion. I feel is some sort of combat engineer battalion as well. To be honest with you, I've heard them mentioned a few times. I haven't really done much due diligence in researching them. Obviously they deserve credit. They were there on the island the whole time, but they don't fall into any of the major stories that we've told in this campaign so far. So I don't know exactly if they are an engineer battalion, but I believe they're a combat engineer battalion as well.
I think in any event, they're going to end up as riflemen anyway, so they're going to fill a gap somewhere and do something.
Well, they ultimately do. And then you also have the amphibian tractor battalions. Those guys initially, back when the Raiders were manning Edson's Ridge, those guys were back on the south end of that perimeter. Edson's Ridge is on the south end of the Lunga defenses.
Okay.
And most of the infantry battalions had been placed along the beach and fortifying the beach because Vandergrift, along with a lot of the other commanders, believed that the Japanese would make an amphibious assault there, that they wouldn't. They've already tried to walk to Mount Austin when they first made landfall, and they were like, forget it. Yeah. This is miserable. The terrain is terrible. And just for those of you that really don't know the layout of Guadalcanal is a series of coral mountains and ridges surrounded by valleys of super dense jungle. Out on the peripheries of the island and along the coast, there is a lot of palm trees. It's a coconut grove. A pair of brothers owned some kind of coconut company back in this time, and so they had developed a lot of that beachfront land into their coconut groves. But the further you got inland, those jungles got really thick, and then you'd have these coral mountains and ridge lines and all that stuff interscattered throughout. So it's terrible terrain. So Vandergrift and the rest of the higher ups really didn't believe early on that the Japanese were going to march through the jungle to attack their southern flank. They thought worst case scenario, they might maybe come from the eastern side of the island. We've already had some actions that take place on that side over towards Alligator Creek. Come from that side and maybe hit, like the southeastern portion of the line. So that whole, right side of the line, the nose of the line that runs along the beach, and then the left-hand side of the line, that's all manned by infantry guys in the beginning. These support troops, the engineers, the pioneers, and the tractor companies, they were placed on that southern defense line along with Vandergrift's HQ, right? So not thinking anything. Now, when Edson's Ridge happens, and they've had their eyes open to the fact that, no, the Japanese will march through the jungle for many, many, many miles to attack your southern flank because they feel that that's the most advantageous place to strike. So moving forward, he's going to take those guys that he had on the southern end of the line, the engineers, the pioneers, the amphibian tractor battalions, and he's going to place them on the beach. They're now manning the beach defenses. This isn't, to talk, not saying that they're not capable Marines or anything, but that, their primary job is not infantry, whereas these other regiments that are there, that is their primary job. So he's going to take, his infantry guys and put them on the most, I guess, at-risk sectors of the line, which is everything else besides the beach. Yeah. So each infantry regiment would be set up with 2 battalions on line and 1 battalion in reserve. Ideally, that's how he wanted to set it up initially, and still to this day, that's typically how it works out. If you're doing, battalion level, or if you're doing company level, usually you'll have 2 of the 3 line platoons on line, 1 in reserve, and weapons platoon will be split up doing whatever whatever their role is, whether it's mortarman, machine gun, assaultman, whatever. Now, as he starts placing people into the defenses, he comes into this problem where he has to actually use 2 different types of defenses, and the terrain dictates this, which you know as well as I do. I mean, there's a few things that get a say in combat. The enemy gets a say, right? You get a say. Yep. You make your plans. You do what you can do. All that stuff. You get a say. The enemy gets a say, and Mother Nature gets a say. Whether that's weather or terrain, I attribute all that to. We'll attribute all that to Mother Nature right now. and that definitely gets a vote in the way combat goes and how it's fought. And Vandergrift and the 1st Marine Division are no different than anybody. Even nowadays, they fall victim to the same rules of combat as far as we've just gone over there. And so the terrain dictates that he has to use 2 different means of defending the line. The first is going to be your classic defense, right? A defense in depth. You're going to have multiple machine gun positions with interlocking fields of fire. And to explain that to those that might not know, when you set up machine guns on a defensive line, so you think about Marines and their fighting holes, and they're spread out, and they're you got riflemen and saw gunners, and whatever. This is in modern era, and then typically you want to have that sector covered by 2 machine guns that are firing from the flanks across the front of this, we'll say, infantry platoon. We'll say it's a platoon strength line, right? Yep. Ideally, you would have your machine guns on the flanks so that they could interlock their fire across the center of that, of that field of fire. And then vice versa, they can also, on the wings, they have the ability to shift their guns the outer direction and link up with the next guys, right? Typically, they won't do that. They'll typically have 2 guns, boom, per spot, one covering one side, one covering the other. But ideally, that's how it works. You want the fire to be interlocking, because one thing is, if the gunfire is only coming from one direction, you can typically hide from gunfire coming from one direction. Yeah. If it's coming from 2 directions, way more complicated. And machine guns, contrary to what Hollywood tries to do or make it seem like, you don't just hold down the trigger and let her rip, right? Like, it's not just this unending fire. You fire in bursts. And we've gone over the length, how long, what you say. They have ditties to teach you how long to hold the trigger down. But it's, it's, what did they say? 5 to 8 round burst or something like that.
6 to 8, 5 to 8, depending on their rate of fire, I suppose. Yeah. They have like 4 different rates of fire, and then each one's a different length of a burst, a different, rest period between those bursts. So.
Right. And they're doing different things and all that stuff. Yeah. But needless to say, it's a burst of fire. There'll be a short pause, and then the other gun on the other side will pick up firing. They'll do a short burst. There'll be a small pause. Then the first one will go back to firing. They alternate.
Talking guns.
And when you see them do it in real life, it is magnificent.
It is.
But the first time you see it in training, it's a little underwhelming, because you see all these Hollywood movies your whole life, and you think about machine guns ripping and roaring, and you think
they're just blazing,
going to town, and that's not the case. It's very controlled. But that being said, when you see it in combat, it is pretty freaking amazing. So anyways, classic defense, and that's going to be in the areas, places like Edson's Ridge, right, where there is open terrain. It's undulating, right? But they're not just confined to the jungle. The other type of defense is going to be something, in a weird way, if you were, you can relate these 2 concepts, but it'd be something that you and I would be more used to. So essentially what he does on this edge of the line, and this is going to be over by Alligator Creek or the Tenaroo River, he doesn't have the capability to have these large sweeping fields of fire with interlocking, machine gun fields of fire and all that stuff. He can't do that. All the coconut groves and the valley jungles and everything else just don't allow it. So what they end up doing is a long strand of barbed wire that runs the length of the line, essentially, uninterrupted. And behind that, you're going to have infantry companies operating. They're not set up in FOBs, but it would be similar to how a FOB is set up in an AO, a forward operating base, and they patrol from there, and they are in charge of a certain AO, but they're self-reliant. They have all their own ammo. They have all their own, fuel. They have all their own water and food and all that stuff. That's the kind of defense that he has to implement on that Alligator Creek, Tenaroo side of the line. And then they have companies that are held in reserve and battalions that are held in reserve behind the line with multiple options of fighting holes to be able to go to if something kicks off. So they're not confined to just one section. They might have to move to there might be 3 different sections of the line they might have to move to, depending on where the Japanese might attack. So it's a much more, I would say, it's a much more dynamic section of the line. It's not so concrete and rigid.
It sounds a lot more complex versus like get on the line and just wait.
Defense in depth can be complicated in a different aspect, but as far as like what's expected of you, I guess, as the infantry guy on the ground in a defense in line, it's pretty freaking basic. Get in your hole. The enemy's going to be coming from that way. Anything that comes out of that direction, right? Yep. Like that's, in a nutshell, that's what it is. It's a lot more complicated on the in the valleys and in the jungle and along the Alligator Creek there. Sure. But I explain all of that. I want everybody to know the defensive, I guess, scenario moving forward, because this is going to be the first time we really get to go on. We get to see the Marines go on the offensive. I know we made the amphibious landing, and we're pretty much unopposed all the way to the airfield. I know we've seen fighting at Alligator Creek and Edson's Ridge, but really we haven't had a major offensive operation in this campaign yet, as far as ground forces go. Up to this point, everything's been, like, at least the big engagements have been defensive, right? Both Edson's Ridge and Alligator Creek, we are on the defense. And things change. When you go from defense to offense, a lot of things are going to change. Typically, your casualty rate is going to go up pretty significantly. It's been well documented. I'm sure this goes back to antiquity, but at least from things that I've studied from Civil War era, Revolutionary War era to now, it's always been well documented that an army on the defense tends to do better when it comes to the casualties, right? That you're firing from covered and concealed positions. You're able to get resupplied quicker. Your guys can get wounded, can get pulled off the line quicker. There's just numerous factors that play into a defensive army having an advantage.
As long as everything holds up.
As long as everything holds up, right? And as long as I guess as long as you have food and ammo too, because there are instances where things like sieges and all that stuff, that plays a factor. But let's just say, taking those off the table, if it's just a one-off battle, you got one army on the defense and one on the offense, typically the one on defense wins, or is at least going to have less casualties. Maybe they don't win, but they will sustain less casualties in the process. That's going to be true of what we're going to see here. Up to this point, the Marines have obviously taken a good deal of casualties in the action so far. Nothing compared to what the Japanese have lost, but they've taken a good number. The numbers are only going to go up from here. Vandergrift has about 19,000 troops on the island now, so he decides to move forward with this plan. He's reasonably sure that the Japanese cannot offer an immediate threat to the southern and eastern flanks of his defenses. This is, again, in the wake of the battle at Edson's Ridge. They killed a lot of Japanese soldiers. And now those guys are having to, march back through jungle. The ones that did survive are having to march back through jungle to make it, to wherever they can to regroup, get reinforced, resupplied, and then launch an attack. So he's fairly certain they're not going to be able to hit him for the foreseeable future. His goal is to take advantage of that, and they want to start moving west. To the west of the Lunga defenses is a river. It's called the Matanikau. And this is actually, you hear about Guadalcanal and you hear about Henderson Field, Edson's Ridge, and the Tenaroo or Alligator Creek. Those are like the big name battles because they happen early on.
Yep.
And they're concise. They're in one place, like they usually go 1 or 2 nights and that's it. They get most of the attention, but the fighting across the Matanikau is actually going to be the bulk of the fighting on Guadalcanal. This is where the majority of the fighting takes place. And this is where we're going to lose a lot of casualties. Like I said, we're going to be on the offensive now, and things are different. But this river, the Matanikau River, it runs north to south along Guadalcanal. And on the far side of the Matanikau, there's a town called Cocumbona. And the goal is Vandergrift wants his forces to be able to push across the Matanikau River, go through, capture Cocumbona, where he can set up a patrol base, a defensive position for either the Raiders to man or a unit to man, so that the Japanese can't use their 155 artillery or their equivalent to their 155. I don't know if they actually have 155 or if it's a different caliber. And the reason I say that is because you have, I mean, Barney style, you have different levels of artillery, right? You have different size rounds. You have 105s, 155s. What's the one underneath 105? Is it 70 millimeter or 75 millimeter?
Our guys had 75
millimeter.
Yeah.
So you have different size rounds, and that means that they can go different distances, right? A 155 can shoot miles. I mean, it's crazy. I think it's like 6 or 8 miles those things can shoot.
Yeah, it's
something
far.
stupid. So when the Americans land in the beginning on Guadalcanal, they're unable to bring their 155 artillery with them. All they can bring are the 75 millimeter mortars, or 70. Forgive me if you know the right answer here. Leave it in the comments. But
I think they're called pack howitzers for the 75 millimeter.
They might be. I don't know enough about artillery to be like, well, that's my apology. But I do know they're not able to bring their 155s. They have to bring their 75 millimeter artillery guns. Well, those 75 artillery guns, like I said, they don't reach as far as a 155. So what ends up happening is around this time, the Japanese land 155 artillery on the island, and they set them up in Cochabamba. And what's happening is they are firing from Cochabamba and hitting Henderson Field, and we can't retaliate because we can't get our guns close enough. Even if we take them up to the lip of the Matanikau River on our side of the river, they're still not reaching Cochabamba. That's how much further those 155s can shoot than a 75. You know. Yeah. So the idea is to take that position in Cochabamba so that the artillery can't continue to bombard the airfield, right? And then also, to keep the momentum up, keep the Japanese on their heels, and keep moving forward with this campaign. But from a tactical level, they're trying to eliminate the pressure of those artillery guns. So to do this, he is going to turn to his freshest, most aggressive battalion commander to do at least the majority of the heavy lifting on this first attempt, and that's going to be Chesty Puller,
heavy lifter,
the legend, right? Chesty Puller. And for those of you that don't know any Marines personally or weren't in the Marine Corps, Chesty Puller is about as close as you can get to an idol in the Marine Corps, right? Like he almost at like deity levels. The guy he's like a mythological being at this point. He's in everything. When you're going to bed in boot camp at night, you're saying goodnight to Chesty wherever he is. When you do push-ups, they're always telling you to do one more. You do everything you do one more for Chesty. Like this, they have picture. We have a picture of Chesty in our studio, and Marines do too. And it's as if Chesty's watching you. So make sure you're doing the right thing. It's in everything. And this guy, you know a lot about him from being in the Marine Corps, but diving deeper into the guy's story and really kind of studying him, I think he's completely deserving of the praise. Just to give you a little bit of background on Chesty Puller before we get into this first offensive action against the Matanikau, he wants to enlist to go fight in World War I. He attends VMI, Virginia Military Institute, for a year, and then withdraws and enlists in the Marine Corps in hopes of making it to World War I to be able to fight. Mm-hmm. He does so well in boot camp that he actually gets chosen to be an instructor, and he goes on. Eventually, they select him for officer candidate school. He goes and he graduates, but he graduates in 1919. The war is over, and just like with any war, the U.S. military downsizes rapidly at the end of a war.
Yes.
So he's out of a job. He's let go. Right, like his discharge. It's over for him. So he decides, well, I'm not done with the Marine Corps. He goes back to being an enlisted man. He instead of being a second lieutenant, which he had just gained, just earned promotion to and then lost, he goes back to being a corporal. And he's going to make a name for himself in the Banana Wars. That's in Haiti and Nicaragua. And he's gonna kind kind of cut his teeth leading small unit patrols in small unit actions, right? So he is going to be in combat down there, not on the same scale as World War II, but I mean, he's engaging and fighting, rebel forces, guerrilla forces, and really earning a name for himself, making a name for himself, and establishing, the tone of how he will approach warfare for the rest of his career, which is extremely aggressively. He will become known as El Tigre by the rebels that he's fighting. I'm assuming that means the tiger.
Yeah,
that's what I assume. I don't know, but he really distinguishes himself. He even earns 2 Navy Crosses in the Banana Wars in his time in Nicaragua. So he had a few philosophies that really stand out. He truly believed. You hear this a lot from guys that fought in World War II. And I have a theory on that. I'll talk about it in a second. But he believed officers should lead from the front, right? They should be up front. And there are many instances where I'll be able to point out exactly that. He is leading from the front when we get into this story. But he believed, the highest requirement for an officer candidate was to be starkly courageous, right? Going back to like Civil War days when officers were expected to sit on a horse, going across the field in line of battle to in a sense, a Napoleonic style fighting, right? The two armies face up, take turns shooting at each other. Being on a horse in that is just insane. First off, everybody knows who you are on the other side. They all know we just aim for you, right? We're good. And you're a more prominent target. You're higher up. Yeah. I mean, that when you get into combat, the thing that you notice the most, and you can notice it when it stands out, and you'll think, I must be fighting someone fairly new, is rounds go high. It's when you're fighting someone that knows what they're doing when the rounds aren't going high, right? Yeah. You can tell you're fighting someone that's done it a little bit, that they keep their rounds on target. I don't know why that is. I vividly remember in Afghanistan being out early on and being on a patrol and getting ambushed, and it was me and one other guy had gotten kind of caught out by the lip of this canal in a single tree by ourselves in the middle of this huge open field. And I just remember we were laying down behind the lip of that canal, and I remember looking up at the tree and just watching branches break out of it, like little branches snapping out of it with the PKM rounds coming through and knocking them out.
And it comes through.
But that's the thing is, I say all that to make the point of sitting on a horse in a battle like that is psychotic. But that's the kind of I guess vision Chesty has for officers. That's what you should be. You starkly courageous, even if it means your own. Do what's expected of you in that sense, and lead from the front.
And you earn the respect of the men that way.
Right. And he loved enlisted guys. He was quoted as saying that out of all his medals, he eventually gets 5 Navy Crosses. That's just a few of the medals he has. Yeah. Which is it's the second highest award you can receive in the Navy or the Marine Corps. It's the equivalent of the Distinguished Service Cross for the Army. So it is no joke, and to have 5 of them is insane.
And it's a ditty at boot camp.
Right, right. But he said, he was quoted as saying that his favorite medal was his Good Conduct Medal, because only enlisted men can get Good Conduct medals, and so most of his fellow officers didn't have one. He's a Mustang, Yep. Now, certainly. That's funny to me because really, and if you're enlisted, you don't give a crap about that Good Conduct medal. I mean, you get it. In all fairness, if you don't get in any trouble, you get it at your 3-year mark. Like you really you get it for just following the rules.
It's important.
It is important, but it is funny they give you a medal for that. Yeah. I've always thought that was kind of interesting. He had some unique features about how he operated in the field as well too. He very rarely, unless there was an absolute need, he would never have a headquarters tent set up. He would always sleep out under the stars in the dirt, like his Marines were doing, in a fighting hole, whatever the case is. There are exceptions to that at different times, but they typically required that it be set up that way. he also doesn't have an officer's mess, especially in naval tradition. The Marine Corps, when we were in, Marine Corps is very big on putting its enlisted people first. Enlisted guys go through the chow line first.
Chow line, yeah.
Officers and staff NCOs typically are the ones serving meals and all that. Well, I think that really kind of begins with Chesty and how he approaches things, because he doesn't have an officer's mess. His men eat the same thing that his officers eat, and his officers eat the same thing his men eat. And he would typically have his officers serving chow to their men, serving it out, and then they would be the last ones to eat as well. So I think that I get the feeling that idea kind of starts with Chesty and maybe people like Chesty at the time. Getting back to my thoughts on how Chesty viewed the role of officers and where he gets his aggressiveness from. His grandfather fought for the Confederacy, and he was a Confederate cavalryman in the Army of Northern Virginia, so under Robert E. Lee. His grandfather actually ends up at Kelly's Ford, which is where John Pelham, the famous Confederate artillerist, is killed. And this is just me spitballing here, but there are so many high-level generals in that army during that window of time that his grandfather served in that army that are uber aggressive. I think that legacy of growing up and hearing stories about his grandfather with these guys, we're talking about people like Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee himself, John Pelham, Jeb Stuart. These are uber aggressive dudes, and still known today for being uber aggressive on the battlefield. I think him growing up and hearing those stories and kind of idolizing those guys' actions on a battlefield, how they conducted themselves in combat, and they led from the front, and they took risks, and they were super aggressive. They weren't afraid to fight. I think he took those to heart as a child, and I think as he grew up, I think that just became part of his personality, because he does end up becoming one of the most aggressive commanders, if not. The only other one that might give him a run for his money is Edson. But I think between the two of them, I think they're probably the most aggressive leaders on Guadalcanal. Hey guys, just wanted to take a quick second to let you know a little bit more about America Fog of War and what we're trying to do with this channel. See, Brett and I both are Marine Corps combat veterans from the Global War on Terror. We fought in both Iraq and Afghanistan. We've also had an intense interest in the history of the American warrior. Now, it would be a lie to say that our opinions aren't somewhat biased, but after all of the study, the research, and things that we've seen with our own eyes, we are both confident that the greatest warrior the world has ever known is the American warrior. Whether we're talking about the American patriots that gained our independence from Great Britain, the blue-clad federal troops that won a victory at Gettysburg, or the Marines that raised the flag on Mount Suribachi, all of them have distinguished themselves far and above what's normally expected of a nation's warrior class. Citizen soldiers that have been willing to sacrifice all upon the altar of freedom. And today, that legacy seems somewhat threatened. It is our goal here to continue telling their stories, to uphold their legacy so that they're never forgotten, and that future generations of American warriors have ideals and standards to strive to reach. Thank you for your support, and as always, stay frosty. Needless to say, on the morning of September 23rd, Chesty's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, it's the battalion he's in charge of. There's about 930 Marines in the battalion. They're going to be charged with conducting a recon and force from the Lunga defenses. They'll come kind of southwest out of the defenses. They're going to march maybe around the foothills of Mount Austin, around the base of Mount Austin, all the way to the Matanikau River, and then walk north up the Matanikau River. Once they get there, they'll link up with the 1st Raider Battalion. They will cross the Matanikau River going along the coastal road, move all the way to Cocombona. The Raiders will start building the base camp, and Chesty and his 1st Battalion, 7th Marines will be kind of setting up a defensive perimeter for them. Again, 1-7, 1st Battalion, 7th Marine, they're fresh. The Raiders have been through the ringer.
Oh yeah,
in the last few months. So, so the plan makes sense. Now, it's going to be early on the morning of the 23rd that Chesty and 1-7 are going to step through the lines on this patrol. The first day they are going to encounter 1 or 2 Japanese reconnaissance patrols, but they chase them off. There's no big engagement on that first day. They end up camping for the night, and the next day they plan on climbing up a portion of Mount Austin. That next day the sun comes up, they get to work, they get to marching, and at around 5 p.m. The leading element of 1-7 is going to come across a group of about 16 Japanese soldiers cooking rice, and they're in an encampment. They're making themselves dinner. Now, remember when I said I have multiple instances where Chesty is actually leading from the front. Chesty will be the 3rd guy in the formation on this movement through the woods. It's the 3rd guy in line for his whole battalion.
Yeah, how about that?
Which means he's got a point man. Maybe he's got a BAR man behind that. Yeah. And then him, right? So I'm guessing at the BAR guy. I don't really know how they did that down to that level, but that in my mind, I could see it being a BAR guy.
Yeah, me too.
But Chesty's third position, right? So they come up on these Japanese soldiers. They end up taking them out, and Chesty goes over, bends down, gets a scoop of rice to test the rice that these Japanese soldiers have been cooking. And as soon as he does, he's bringing it to his mouth, and a machine gun round rips through the rice pot that he just got the rice out of. I think it ends up hitting an orderly, one of his orderlies next to him.
Oh no!
And then the fight's on. What had happened was the noise from the skirmish with those 16 Japanese soldiers that were cooking rice alerted other Japanese forces near there. So they had moved down and were trying to counter this American presence. A pretty decent sized fight erupts, and what ends up happening is the Americans end up killing about 30 of the Japanese troops. The Japanese run off. And the U.S. Marines take about 13 KIA and around 25 wounded in action.
Wow.
So this is just the second day of this reconnaissance, and they're way deep in the jungle now. So Puller, he's going to radio back to Vandergrift, and he's going to ask to have stretchers sent forward. And so to send these stretchers forward, Vandergrift sends 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. And 2-5 gets there. They load up all these wounded onto stretchers, and instead of sending 2-5 back with the stretchers, this is interesting to me. I don't know why Puller decides to do it this way, but Puller will send back 3 of his 4 companies, A, B, and D company. Well, at least 2 full companies and maybe a portion of a 3rd, but A, B, and D companies will be sent back to carry the stretchers, the 25 wounded guys. Yeah. And Puller ends up taking over 2-5. So now he has his Charlie Company with him still, and now he's in charge of 2-5 as well. And you think to yourself, well, why would the 2-5 commander give up command of his battalion? Well, at the time, the 2-5 commander is a captain. I mean, that's how I guess they were short-staffed with lieutenant colonels at the time. But sure. Anyways, Chesty takes over, sends his 3 companies back with the stretchers. And the reason why he has to send so many guys back with these stretcher bearers, I point this out because if you hear that, you think 3 companies, there's like 150 to 200 guys in a company. Why is he sending so many guys back for 25 stretchers? Yeah. And I will just tell you that if that's a question you're asking, I don't think you've ever carried stretchers through terrible terrain, especially like mountains and jungle, like a jungle mountain, right? Like thick brush and up and down a mountain at the same time. That is brutal. It's brutal. And it's not like you can't accidentally drop these guys. You can't be rough with them. You're trying to be gentle with them. And then at the same time, people have to be holding security because you're moving a lot slower than you would be if you if you didn't have any wounded.
Yeah.
And there's just a bunch of factors that go into it. So Chesty has to send back 3 companies, and he does. Now, they'll bivouac there on Mount Austin, or I'm sorry, between Mount Austin and the Matanikau River that night. The next morning, Puller and Charlie Company and 2-5 get up and they begin moving towards the Matanikau River. Now, again, we're still inland, so we're still a good distance south of the coastline. But eventually they do reach the river. They get to this area called the One Log Bridge. And I've tried to find pictures of the One Log Bridge and have not been able to do so. I've heard it described as 1 or 2 logs just lazily placed across the river as an impromptu bridge. It would have been cool to find a picture of it though. Yeah. But needless to say, they run into this One Log Bridge. Puller sends some guys across just to scout it out. They end up getting engaged. He pulls them back, and they decided they're just going to keep moving up the eastern side of the river, on the American side of the river, towards the coast. And so they do. They keep moving. They make it down to the coastline, and once they get to the coastline, they think, all right, there's a sandbar here. We're gonna cross the river at this point, which has been the idea the whole time, anyways. Chesty Puller leading the advance. He'll be in the front of the advance column, right?
Like a boss.
Is leading these guys across the Matanikau River, and they get out. They get out into the water. Some of them are in like thigh deep water and very exposed. And multiple Japanese defensive positions open up, and they're, from what I've read, they're in a very, very good spot. And 2-5 starts losing guys left and right. So Puller pulls them back. Chesty pulls them back is probably an easier way to say that. But Chesty pulls his guys back, and they get set up in a defensive position. Vandergrift that afternoon will end up sending Mike Edson, who is now in charge of the 5th Marines. He's been placed in command of the 5th Marines after Edson's Ridge. He will send Edson down that way. He will send the 1st Raider Battalion with him as he goes, right? So Edson's supposed to go down there, take control of the operation, and come up with a new game plan on how to get across the Matanikau. Well, Puller and Edson jointly will come up with this. It is a smart plan. There's a lot of moving parts, so as we'll see, things can go wrong. But it is a pretty sound plan initially. In the morning, that next morning, with the way they plan on going about crossing the Matanikau, is having the Marines of 2-5 and the 1st Raider Battalion make a feint attack, if you will, across the mouth of the river where they just attempted to cross, earlier that day. While they're making that feint, action across, not necessarily across, I guess feint action for Point Cruz. They do intend to cross the river, but they don't intend to go too far inland from the river, right? They want to get far enough to get a little foothold and keep the Japanese occupied.
Yeah.
At the same time, once they get across the river, the rest of Puller's companies from 1-7, so that'd be Alpha, Bravo, and Delta companies, would board Higgins boats, sail from Lunga Point, and then land on the western side of Point Cruz. And Point Cruz is this little peninsular land feature that is on the western, the west bank, essentially, of the Matanikau River. They want them to make landfall near there, and then basically cut off any Japanese forces on Point Cruz and attack whatever this defensive line is from the rear, so that they can break through this defense and continue moving on towards Kokumbona. Great plan in theory.
Yes.
But unfortunately, some things do go terribly wrong. So the next day, Puller's C Company and the 1st Raider Battalion, they wake up in the morning, they start attempting to cross the river. And very quickly, they get into a really terrible situation. The Japanese defenses are super strong. The way they're approaching has them on this shelf, essentially pinned between, almost a sheer cliff in the water. So they're just it's a terrible place to try to make an advance. From what I've heard it described as and read it described as, it's one of the most effective bottlenecks that any of these guys had seen the Japanese use to their advantage. And on top of this, communications are performing poorly is a vast understatement. They're terrible at this time. And the reason that is there's this bombardment of Lunga Point, the defenses at Lunga Point happening, and it knocks out their comms tower. So the last word that Edson and Vandergrift both get, is that his raiders have made it across the river, when in fact they have not made it across the river. They're in the river trying to get across the river.
Oh boy.
And getting ready to pull back because things are just too intense. But getting that word, Vandergrift goes ahead and launches A, B, and D company of 1-7 from Lunga Point on those Higgins boats. Higgins boats are the boats you see in Saving Private Ryan, where the front, they're an amphibious assault vehicle, and the front door comes down and they run, makes a ramp that they can run onto the beach on. So these guys start making their way around, out past the Matanikau River, out to sea, past the Matanikau River, around Point Cruz to make landfall on that western side of the peninsula there. And they make landfall. Everybody gets on the beach fine, and they move about 350 yards inland to a bare knoll, a ridge line that's barren, essentially. And again, these are coral mountains. That's why there's no vegetation growing on them, really. Most of the mountains you see on Guadalcanal are barren. But anyways, they take up position there. It's called Hill 84. Unfortunately for them, Japanese reinforcements were already on their way down that direction because of the fighting taking place at the mouth of the Matanikau. So when these American troops land, they get hit from their west by that unit coming down the road there to occupy Point Cruz and all that stuff, and they get hit from their east from Japanese troops on that side of them as well. So right off the bat, they're pretty much surrounded and cut off.
Well, another problem with these coral ridges and mountains and stuff, you're not digging in on that either. So
you're not digging in. You're right.
Kind of out in the open
right
at that point.
Right. And it's just super exposed. And to make matters worse, there's a few things that happen that really just are icing on the cake for this. But the acting battalion commander, his name is Major Ortho Rogers, is killed almost immediately in the opening bursts. So command and control out the window. I mean, at least at that level, the guys take the job. I'm not saying people don't step up to take the job, but they do. Captain Charles Kelly ends up taking control and setting the Marines up in a defensive perimeter. But the Marines they were referencing Custer's Last Stand. That's how bad it was. They were calling this mini Dunkirk or something. Wow. Just terrible scenario. Now, another thing adding to problems is the Marines on top of Hill 84 did not have radio comms. And the reason they didn't have radio comms, the radio operator, Sergeant Robert Raysbrook, I guess, everything was so quick when they got the order to launch and so excited that he didn't bring the radio with him.
Oh, no.
So now they're in this terrible situation and they don't have a radio. And they're cut off. They're way behind enemy lines, right? And the Higgins boats dropped them off and left. The Higgins boats went back to Lunga Point. They didn't just stay on the beach.
Yeah.
So they really are over there stranded by themselves in a really terrible scenario. Well, lucky for them, these guys are still fairly new on the island, and they still have their white skivvy shirts. Back then they had white skivvy shirts instead of the green they wear today.
Okay.
The guys that had been there for a while, the 1st Marines and the 5th Marines, the regiments that had been there for a while, they didn't have any skivvies left. They had all rotten off in the jungle. But these guys being new, they still had them. So what they end up doing is they all end up taking off their white shirts and they spell out help on this bald ridge line. There's a wide open field essentially on this mountain. They spell out help with their white T-shirts really big. And the Cactus Air Force pilot is flying by, supporting this operation taking place at the mouth of the Matanikau. And he sees this. He sees the word help spelled with white T-shirts. So he radios back to Edson and to Vandergrift like, yo, your guys, I don't know what's happening, but they spelled out help with their white T-shirts. I think you need to get over there to them. Now, Edson receives this message. His Raider battalion it fails to cross the Matanikau. They're taking tremendous casualties in the process. And just speaking to those around him, he states, I guess we better call them off. They can't seem to cross the river, talking about, his guys. Well, Chesty Puller hears this and is immediately infuriated, because the majority of his battalion is on the other side of the Matanikau, and they're in a really terrible spot. So he is, I guess, recorded as saying something along the lines of, "You're not going to throw away these men." And getting up, storming out of the COC, the command center, off towards the beach, where he's going to wave down a Navy ship, like a big cruiser or destroyer. It's a destroyer. He waves down a destroyer. They come over, they pick him up. He gets on board. He tells them what's going on, and they sail over towards Point Cruz.
Get him, Chesty.
Well, when he gets there, this stuff, you can't make this stuff up. This is crazy. And if I were to see this in a movie, I'd be like, no freaking way. That's not how. But this is really what's happening.
Wow.
They sail over there, and they get right off the coast of where these Marines are stranded. They still don't have a way to talk to them, though. There's no radio, and they got to send in artillery to get these Japanese troops pushed back so they can clear an exit for them to get to the beach. They can't just. They've been surrounded. They can't just get down there. But Sergeant Robert Raysbrook, to make up for having forgotten the radio, I guess, to begin with, he volunteers himself to go out and amidst this incoming heavy Japanese enemy fire, right? Stand out in the open and do the semaphore flags. I don't know if you guys know what I'm talking about. Have you ever seen, like, on old Navy boats, they'll use the little flags to send codes back and forth to each other? He gets out on top of this bald hill, no cover, exposed to enemy fire, and starts semaphoring the boat. Well, Chesty Puller's an old Marine, right? He's an old breed. Like he's really lived the naval life, sailing all over the place. So he knows semaphore. So Chesty Puller himself is semaphoring back to this guy. Just crazy. It's just crazy. Wow. And so they communicate where they're going to their artillery. They're going to pummel this side, and then when it lifts, you guys make a run for the beach. And they do that, right? They start bombarding this area around Hill 84 to relieve pressure on these guys. At that point, Chesty Puller radios back to the Coast Guardmen that are manning the Higgins boats that had taken the three companies over there initially, and says, "Hey, I need you guys to come get my Marines off the beach." And this leads us into another pretty fascinating story. It's about a guy named Signalman First Class Douglas Monroe, who is a Coast Guardsman. It's a pretty fascinating story, and it's a pretty special story, especially to the guys of the Coast Guard, men and women of the Coast Guard. This is, I would assume, something very similar to like how we feel about John Basilone. Okay. I feel like they got to feel this very similar to this about this guy. But Douglas Monroe ends up taking, he leads 10 of these 8 Higgins boats and then 2 LVTs, which are basically amphibious tanks. Yeah. He leads these 10 watercraft back over to the rendezvous to get these guys off the beach. And, as they approach they're being taken under enemy fire. The Marines are down on the beach now, right, and it completely exposed. So they're trying to rush in there and get these guys, back on board and out of danger. A few different times, Douglas Monroe is going to put his Higgins boat in between the Marines and the beach as they're coming out to try to get onto these other craft. He's going to line his up as a shield essentially and engage with his mounted machine gun these Japanese positions. And then after things are going on for a little bit, eventually one of these LVTs, these amphibious tanks, gets stuck on a sandbar, and so Monroe orders that a few other craft work on getting that thing off the sandbar and freed, able to get back out to sea. and he moved further up to the beach, getting even more in between the Marines and where the enemy fire was coming from to act as a shield just until this matter could be resolved. And it's, when he does that, eventually he's ended up wounded. He's on the base of the skull and he passes out. Well, eventually they get that LVT dislodged from the sandbar, and everybody starts pulling. They start pulling away from the beach. They've picked up the Marines, and I'm going to interject here. I'm going to interrupt this story just to kind of tell you, what things are looking like as far as the Marine side go. They had 24 at this battle. 24 guys were. They ended up having to leave 18 of them there. So to this day, on Guadalcanal, near the Matanical River on Hill 84, there are 18 Marines that have never been recovered.
That's the second time actually happening, because the same thing happened at the Getchie Patrol.
Yeah,
they're still there.
Yeah, so it's which would be super that's obviously heartbreaking to have to do that. But again, we live in this era where we're so used to hearing "leave no man behind." There are certain circumstances, unfortunately, when you get into warfare this big and this epic and like this costly, there are times when that is just not feasible.
Right.
And as sad and unfortunate as that is, and I hope we never get to a war where we have that happening, again. But unfortunately, you get into, what's happening in Ukraine right now. I guarantee you there are times when it's just not feasible. You just can't. The cost in life to recover would be far too great to be able to do it. So unfortunately that's what's happening. But they do get the Marines, the ones that are alive, they do get them back on these Higgins boats and then back out to sea and towards Lunga Point. Now, Douglas Monroe is said to have regained consciousness after they got a little ways away from the beach. And it's rumored that with his breath, he asks if they were able to get the Marines off the beach. And they told him, yep. And then he died. And he is the only Coast Guardsman in the history of the United States Coast Guard to ever be awarded the Medal of Honor, still to this day.
How about that?
So pretty heroic stuff. And one guy that I kind of skipped over, I'm going to go back a little bit because his story is pretty, it's incredibly brave. Hey guys, the next part of this episode gets pretty graphic. So to ensure that this episode doesn't get taken down or demonetized, you'll have to go over to our Patreon to hear the complete, uncensored version. Visit patreon.com/America Fog of War and become a member for just $5 a month. You'll get access to all of our content early, ad-free, and uncensored. Make sure you don't miss any of the story. And as always, stay frosty.
I think hey might be a better idea to start. Hey, thanks for watching our show. If you're looking to get more out of America... Here we go. Hey, thanks for tuning in to America Fog of... Hey, thanks for watching our show. If you're looking to get more out of America Fog of War, or if you're trying to get more of America Fog of War, or are looking... Hey, thanks for tuning into our show. If you are looking to get more from America Fog of War, or are looking for a way to help us, or you're just looking to help... Recut. If you're trying to get... If you want more content from America Fog of War, or you're looking for a way to support the show, consider becoming a Patreon. Wait, a Patreon? It's a patron. Instead of consider becoming a Patreon, consider joining our Patreon. Okay. For just $5 a month, you can... For just $5 a month, you can submit questions to be answered on air. Log into a monthly Zoom call with either Colby or myself to discuss related topics, to discuss U.S. military history or any topic related to it, and gain early ad-free access to all of our content. And gain early ad-free content to all of our content. And gain early and gain early ad-free content to all of our content. And gain, redo. Visit patreon.com/America Fog of War or click the link in our description and help us to maintain the legacy, to help us honor the legacy of the American warrior. Hey, I'm not that good at this. If you like the show, join the Patreon for $5 a month. Thank you.
Getting into the effects that this attack are going to have and the aftermath. The enemy force, which had held the Marines immobile during the operation, nearly succeeded in cutting off Polar's battalion. It's a very strong one. It's a large enemy force, and during the operation, it had given the impression of having been well led and intelligently directed. Its size is estimated at around 1,800 men. And there was no indication that, contact, at least to the American leaders, there was no indication that contact had been made with all of the Japanese forces on the island. Like, this still seemed to be early on in the fight for them. Like, so they must have a very big force on the island still. Needless to say, this failed action, this first failed action along the Matanikau, it is the only large defeat that the Marines are going to suffer during the Guadalcanal campaign. It's going to be kind of costly for them. There's going to be 67 Marines killed and 125 wounded in this action, this 2-day action, and like I said, it's a big loss for them. They're repelled in a pretty nasty way. But all that to be said, the Marines will learn from this experience and would implement what they learned very effectively in the next attempt, which is going to take us pretty much into through the rest of September into October for what we call the second Matanikau offensive. Now, just to kind of give you a little bit of background on what's happening on the Japanese end of things, they're going to continue to deliver additional forces to Guadalcanal, supplies, information, at least as far as the Americans are concerned, information from higher headquarters, coast watchers, aerial reconnaissance, and ground patrols indicated that the Japanese were building up strength in the west in preparation for an offensive action. Opposing patrols were clashing daily on the eastern bank of the Matanikau. That's on the U.S. side of the Matanikau River. Like I had mentioned before, Japanese artillery from being fired from Kokumbona is impacting Henderson Field, and really it's causing damage. Aircraft are being damaged. They're constantly having to repair the runways. It needs to be dealt with.
It's a continuous problem.
So all that to be said, the 1st Marine Division were determined to trap the enemy near Point Cruz and drive any survivors west out of the Matanikau Valley. Right, so get them away, get them out of here. We need a bigger buffer. If this operation succeeded, a patrol base could be established at Kokumbona like they wanted to before, and the airfield would be safe from artillery. Applying lessons learned from the first action along the Matanikau, this time the Marines prepared a carefully coordinated plan of action involving 5 battalions. There'd be two battalions from the 5th Marine Regiment, 2 battalions from the 7th Marine Regiment, and 1 from the 2nd Marine Regiment. The division's plan of attack also called for the 5th Marines to move west along the coast, very similar to how the first attack went, where you have one body of troops moving along the coastal road right towards the mouth of the Matanikau, and another one making a wide sweep to the south and west to cross the Matanikau River down there. Even though in the first one, Polar doesn't cross the Matanikau, he ends up going up the eastern bank of the Matanikau. It's the same layout. This time they're going to commit, however, to getting to the other side of the Matanikau River, so they can get some units behind those Japanese defenses and ideally roll them right up along the riverbank. But the 5th Marines would be the force that would move along the coastal road towards the mouth of the Matanikau River, while the 7th Marines and a reinforced battalion from the 2nd Marine Regiment as well also moved that southwesterly direction, crossed Matanikau, and then made a move towards Point Cruz, implementing that single log bridge to get get to the other side. Now, one interesting thing I wanted to talk about here before we get into the actual fighting, there will be a third group. So we have the 5th Marines coming across the coastal road, the 7th Marines moving, deeper in the jungle past Mount Austin, across the river down in the southern jungly portion of the map. But there'll be one other group called the Whaling Group, and this is I want to talk about them a little bit because they this is pretty cool, and I wish I could have found more info on this, but it was freaking I could not find anything, like really anything on this at all. But there's this Colonel William J. Whaling from the 5th Marine Regiment. He was the 5th Marines XO. He had actually been relieved. His commanding officer, the CO for the 5th Marine Regiment, was relieved when Edson was promoted, part of Vandergrift's like reorganization of his higher echelon leaders. And when that 5th Marine Regiment commander was relieved, so was Colonel Whaling. He was the XO battalion of the regiment. He was relieved as well, but he was also a very capable Marine and had some, I guess had some guys vouching for him, and so wasn't sent home like his CO was. He was kept there on the island. Well, Whaling approaches Vandergrift with this idea to create a special scouts and snipers unit to be able to, navigate the jungle better, like basically be on point for patrols so that they're not running into Japanese ambushes. Just utilizing scouting abilities through the jungle at a higher level. Whaling is he's an experienced jungle hand, a marksman, and a hunter. He visualized a scouting and reconnaissance unit that operated at the divisional level, right? So that there'd be one unit for the division to employ however they need to, whether that's breaking them up and sending, a few to each regiment, or however they wanted to use them was for the division to use. They're I guess at a level higher than your normal infantry battalion level, right? That have scouting and patrolling elements in them. These guys are, it's a lot more specialized. It'd be like, it would be like, I guess every division, like 2nd Mardiv, has 2nd Reconnaissance Battalion, right? That they're a divisional asset. They support the entire division. They're not just tied to one, regiment or whatever. Yeah. And the division commander can send them to do whatever mission he wants. They're highly specialized. That's what these guys are supposed to be like. Now, each Marine infantry battalion was told to send 3 Marines that showed high aptitude and ability in their ability for marksmanship, jungle navigation, and bushcraft. Those Marines would attend Whaling's Scout Sniper School that he formed on Guadalcanal. Right, so they're going to school on the island, which
sounds like an in-dock on Guadalcanal.
Right, it's exactly what it was. They're instructed in advanced reconnaissance techniques, stalking, jungle navigation, and ambush tactics. While some Marines will go through the process and not be selected, very much an in-dock process. There will be others that would be sent to take their place, and very quickly. Whaling forms the 1st Marine Division's Scouts and Snipers Detachment. And with that group of Marines, he will take 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marine Regiment, and form what's called the Whaling Group, and they'll be that 3rd element. And they're going to move pretty much parallel to the 7th Marines, when moving south and west out of the Lunga defenses, past Mount Austin, over the Matanikaw River to get into the rear of those Japanese defenses.
Okay. So it's like a satellite element that's just with more capabilities in a way.
Right. And I think you think about a scout sniper today, snipers tends to be the prominent thing that stands out to you when you think of like a scout sniper today.
Yep.
I think these guys were both, but I think the prominent thing for them was scouts. I think that's really how they were going to be employed. Is scouting, scouting routes through the jungle, making sure we're not going to run into enemy ambushes, locating the enemy. Because, much like the Vietnamese, the Japanese are very good at camouflaging too, Anyways, I say all that. That's all I could find on whaling scouts and snipers
Interesting
detachment.
enough, though.
I wish I could have found a little more. Like, I couldn't even find a picture of the school. I know they probably didn't have a building or anything, but you'd think there'd be a sign or something. I couldn't find anything.
Something handmade and fun.
If anybody listening or watching knows where I can find more information on whaling's original scouts and snipers, please leave a comment. Let us know where we can find it. That's the kind of stuff we like coming across.
Cool. That'd be cool.
Needless to say, let's get right to the operation. On October 7th, the 5th Marines are going to deploy forward right there to the eastern bank of the mouth of the Matanikaw. They're going to run into a Japanese company dug in on the eastern side of the bank, and obviously they're going to get into a pretty good little tick, a good little. 2-5 manages to secure most of its assigned frontage further up the river, but 3-5, who's actually at the mouth of the river, is unable to break the enemy loose of its very, very well fortified position. Colonel Edson is going to commit his reserves to battle. He's in charge of the element that's up there by the mouth of the river, and then he's going to radio division for reinforcements. They're going to send A Company of the 1st Raider Battalion down to join the 5th Marines, and 3-5, 2-5, and A Company of the Raiders are going to be pretty much engaged the rest of this story. I mean, it might slow up here and there a little bit, but pretty much the rest of the story, they're going to be getting after it continuously. The whaling group and the 7th Marines are going to manage, to move out from the Lunga defenses, make their way through the jungle past Mount Austin, and they're going to reach the single log bridge and cross it. They cross the river that night, the night of October 7th, and I think they do this throughout the night because I think they're still crossing. Some of them are still crossing the next morning. But they those that make it across the river end up bivouacking on the western bank, and preparing to move north from there the next morning to really, really sneak in behind these Japanese soldiers and give it to them. At the mouth of the river, Japanese soldiers will probe 3-5's lines throughout the night. Now, again, they're the ones that are actually at the mouth of the river.
Yep.
2-5 is a little further inland, online with them, but they're manning that sandbar area, really the only crossing point that's feasible in that region of the river. And the Japanese are going to be probing it all night. For the company nearest the sandbar, it would be extremely. They're also having to fight amidst a very heavy rain, so just making your visibility, everything, so much worse. Now that would continue into the morning, where again, they're, as far as 3-5 goes at the mouth of the river, they're just dealing with a very stubborn Japanese resistance. For the whaling group and the 7th Marines, however, they get up and get right back to work, making their way across, finishing crossing the river and then moving north towards Point Cruz and the coastline. However, that rain is going to significantly slow their pace down. It's going to be near sundown when the whaling group will make it to the first ridge west of the river. There's a few different ridge lines. The whaling group will make it there, to the first one. They'll be the first unit there. It's about a mile south of Point Cruz. At this same time that the whaling group has taken up this position on that first ridge, H Company 2-5 has advanced into an exposed position between a Japanese company on the east bank and a Japanese battalion on the west bank along the river. And they're in a very crappy position, man, sure. and in a bad way. Now they will end up getting out of that position eventually. But the big important thing for this story is the Japanese commander is unaware that there are U.S. Marines on the western bank of the Matanikaw River at this point, and he makes a very costly decision and orders the troops that are in place around H Company 2-5 to stay in place, right?
Keep them surrounded.
Yeah, keep them surrounded. We're gonna take care of them, without knowing that battalion that's on the west bank has the entire whaling group behind it, right? And has it. I mean, it has it to rights, right? And if they decide to attack, those Japanese troops are screwed.
I think it's the main attack, and just focus there.
Yeah. So Needless to say, that's that night down by the mouth of the river. They're still fighting to kind of eliminate this last little holdout pocket of Japanese troops. But then on the morning of October 9th, the Marines west of the Matanakow renew the offensive. The Whaling Group and 2-7 reach the shoreline around Point Cruz. They trap a large number of Japanese troops between themselves and the Matanakow River, and basically start pummeling them.
Just drive them out there.
Yeah. Now, the biggest crisis for the Japanese on the morning of October 9th is a little further west along a parallel ridge line. Chesty Puller and 1-7 will be walking along this ridge line and look down into a valley. And again, just to reiterate, the mountains and ridge lines are barren. The valleys are very thick jungle. And so the Japanese would set up their bivouacs in the valleys, right? Be hidden amongst all this foliage and stuff. Well, Chesty and 1-7 are walking along this ridge line and notice a brand new Japanese battalion's bivouac is set up in this valley. And so Chesty Puller, he calls in artillery. He has his mortarmen dumping mortar rounds in there. He sets up his machine guns and all of his infantry guys with their small arms, and they basically this battalion. The battalion, as it's getting bombarded while it's down in the valley, and then it tries to run up the opposite ridge line, and the Marines on the other side are just machine guns and small arms.
Get him, Chesty.
Chesty estimated that 1-7 had killed about 200 Japanese that day. Japanese records said that him and 1-7 actually killed about 500. So I mean, I take which one you will, but still clearly killed a lot of dudes. Hey,
man, he makes it look easy.
Yeah. I mean, listen, man, he's a fighter. You can't deny that. But Chesty actually ended up calling, saying of his mortars that they were a machine of extraction in this process, right? Of down in these Japanese bivouacs down in this valley. But having received intelligence that the Japanese were planning a large surprise offensive somewhere on Guadalcanal, Vandergrift is actually going to order all the Marines that are west of the Matanakow River, even though they're having extreme success at this point. Yeah. He's going to order them to disengage and return to the east bank of the river, which by the evening of the 9th, that same day, they will do.
Sounds almost like a guerrilla tactic. Get in there, gain overwhelming superiority, do your damage, pull out.
I do get why Vandergrift orders this, because he doesn't know where the attack is going to be coming from or when it's going to be coming, how big it's going to be. He doesn't know any of that. He's got a very large portion of the troops he does have on the island out there west of the Matanakow. And remember, the primary goal of this whole thing is that airfield, right? Yeah. He can't risk losing that airfield. And so, he makes the call to pull his guys back, consolidate, and get back into a defensive perimeter. And that's just what he does. Now, the second offensive around the Matanakow inflicted heavy casualties on the Japanese 4th Infantry Regiment, around 700 of them. And during this operation, 65 Marines would be killed. The failure of the Japanese to gain and hold a strong position on the Matanakow River would prove to have lasting strategic consequences in the Battle for Guadalcanal. It will significantly contribute to the ultimate Allied victory. The Japanese will determine from this point that reestablishing a position on the eastern bank of the Matanakow would be too costly. And because of this, they make a fatal error when planning their counterattack. They opt to send their troops on a long, very arduous march through the jungle to attack the southern perimeter of the Lunga defenses again. This time, those dudes are marching even further than they did the first time.
Yeah.
And as we'll see in a second, it is rough. Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another episode of America Fog of War. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please make sure you subscribe to the channel and leave us a 5-star review. It goes a long way in helping us out and getting this show out to other people. If you're watching on YouTube, please make sure you give this video a like. Also, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you stay up to date on all of our latest content. If you're looking for more of America Fog of War or just a way to help the show out, then please consider becoming a member over at our Patreon. For just $5 a month, you get early ad-free access to all of our content, as well as numerous other benefits, and it goes a long way in helping us maintain, honor, and uphold the legacy of the American warrior. Thank you so much, and as always, stay frosty.